Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the most seductive, most dangerous, and most Hollywood drug you've probably never thought about since the 1970s ended. Here's a fact that should stop you cold. Quaaludes, small, white, chalky pills that look like something your grandmother would take for a headache, were originally designed by scientists who genuinely believed they had created the perfect sleeping pill. Safe, non-addictive, a medical miracle. Within 10 years of hitting the American market, they had destroyed thousands of lives, fueled one of the most predatory party cultures in the entertainment history, and become the drug of choice for powerful men who used them on people who had no idea what they were swallowing. The pill that was supposed to help you sleep turned out to be the pill that made sure certain people never woke up the same again. That's the paradox at the heart of this story. A drug born in a laboratory with the best of intentions, handed to the worst possible people, in the worst possible city, at the worst possible moment in American cultural history, and Hollywood, naturally, loved it. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Los Angeles, in 1971, looked like a promise. The air smelled like jasmine and exhaust fumes. The hills above Sunset Boulevard were full of houses where rock stars slept until noon, and every third person you met on the strip claimed to know someone who could make you famous. The city operated on a specific kind of intoxication that had nothing to do with chemicals. It was the intoxication of proximity. You were close to something enormous. You could feel it. You just needed the right door to open. Danny Caruso felt that intoxication the moment his Greyhound bus pulled into downtown Los Angeles on a Tuesday morning in March 1971. He was 24 years old, from a small industrial town outside Columbus, Ohio, and he had been playing guitar since he was 11. He wasn't delusional about his talent. He was genuinely good. Good enough that 3 different people in Columbus had told him to go to LA, which in 1971 was the musical equivalent of being told by God to walk toward the burning bush. So he walked. He had $240 in his wallet, a used Fender Stratocaster in a hard case, a demo tape recorded in his friend's basement, and the kind of confidence that only exists before reality has had a chance to weigh in. He found a room in a shared house in Silver Lake for $60 a month. The house smelled like cat and someone else's cooking, and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument and every guitar riff from every other aspiring musician in the building. Danny didn't mind. He was in Los Angeles. The clock had started. The first 3 weeks were exactly what you'd expect from someone who arrived with more courage than contacts. He walked into record labels, was turned away at the front desk. He played small open mics in bars where the bartenders were louder than the audience. He handed his demo tape to anyone who would take it, and watched most of them set it down on whatever surface was nearby with the particular politeness of someone who has no intention of ever picking it up again. The city was full of people exactly like Danny, young, talented, convinced they were the exception. What separated Danny from most of them, at least in those early weeks, was discipline. He practiced 3 hours every morning. He didn't drink heavily. He was, by any reasonable measure, doing exactly what someone serious about a music career was supposed to do. Then he went to a party in Laurel Canyon. A session musician he'd met at an open mic invited him. Casually, almost as an afterthought, the way people in LA issue invitations they don't particularly expect you to accept. Danny accepted. The house belonged to someone whose name Danny didn't recognize, but whose home suggested extraordinary wealth. High ceilings, a pool that glowed turquoise in the dark, rooms that opened onto other rooms in a way that suggested the architect had been paid to make space feel infinite. The guests were a mix of musicians, industry people, and beautiful strangers whose precise occupation was never quite clear. The music was loud and physical. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and something sweeter underneath. At some point past midnight, a woman Danny had been talking to, older than him, effortlessly comfortable in the way that people with money or connections always are, reached into her small purse and produced 2 small white tablets. She placed one in her own mouth without ceremony, held the other out to Danny, and described what it was in exactly 4 words. He had never heard of Quaaludes. He took it anyway, because he was 24 in Laurel Canyon, at a party full of people who seemed to know something he didn't, and because saying no in that moment would have felt like admitting he didn't belong there. And Danny Caruso had not come all the way from Ohio to not belong. What happened next is important to understand because it explains everything that followed. It wasn't a violent experience. There was no explosion, no sudden euphoria, no moment where the room turned into a carnival. Quaaludes don't work like that. Instead, something much more insidious happened. Over the course of about 30 minutes, the edges of everything softened. The anxiety that Danny had been carrying since the moment his bus crossed the California state line, the constant low-grade hum of not enough yet, the pressure of being someone who hasn't proven himself, simply stopped. Not gradually. It just stopped, the way a radio cuts out when you pull the plug. He felt warm. He felt capable. He felt for the first time since arriving in Los Angeles like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The physical sensation was unlike anything he'd encountered. His body felt pleasantly heavy, like sinking into deep water without any of the drowning. His thoughts moved slowly and felt important. Music coming from the speakers across the room seemed to arrive directly inside his chest. The world, which had been pressuring him relentlessly for 3 weeks, had simply agreed to leave him alone for a while. He sat by the pool until 4 a.m. and watched the water move. This is the part that drug education campaigns almost always get wrong. They show the destruction, the seizures, the arrests, the hollow-eyed people in hospital beds, and all of that is real and all of that is coming. But they skip the beginning, and the beginning is the entire reason the rest happens. Danny Caruso didn't become an addict that night because he was weak or stupid or self-destructive. He became an addict because the drug worked. It did exactly what the most desperate part of him needed it to do. It silenced the fear. And when the pill wore off around dawn and the fear came back, louder this time, sharpened by contrast, the first thought Danny had was not about music or career or Ohio. It was about where he could get another one. He didn't act on that thought immediately. He went home, slept until noon, woke up feeling slightly hollow but functional, and spent the afternoon convincing himself it had just been a good night and he didn't need to make anything more of it. This is also completely normal. The first stage of addiction is almost always characterized by a period of perfectly reasonable self-assurance that you're in control of the situation. You aren't. But you don't know that yet, and the drug is patient. 3 days later, back at a smaller gathering through the same social network, someone offered him another one. He said yes before the sentence was finished. And this time, because he was a little more prepared for it, because the anxiety of the last 3 days had been particularly loud, the relief was even sharper, even better, like the first time had been a rough draft and this was the finished version. Danny Caruso had been in Los Angeles for less than a month. He had not yet signed a record deal, had not yet played a professional show, had not yet made a single dollar from music. But he had already discovered the thing that would rewrite every plan he'd ever made for himself, quietly, efficiently, without a single dramatic warning sign. The city outside kept moving. The Sunset Strip lit up every night like a fever dream. Somewhere in those hills, decisions were being made about who would become famous and who would not, and none of those decisions had anything to do with talent. Danny didn't know any of that yet. He was 24, he was in Los Angeles, and he had found something that made the waiting bearable. That was all it took. 6 weeks after that first night in Laurel Canyon, Danny Caruso got the call he'd been waiting for since Ohio. A mid-tier record label called Meridian Sound had listened to his demo tape, not because Danny had handed it to the right person, but because the session musician who'd invited him to that first party had mentioned his name to a producer named Gerald Fitch. Fitch was not a powerful man by Hollywood standards. He operated in the middle tier of the industry, the zone where genuine talent occasionally surfaced, but was more often chewed up and processed into something more commercially palatable. He had signed 3 moderately successful acts in the previous 5 years and was looking for a 4th. Danny's tape was rough, but there was something in it, a particular quality in the guitar work that Fitch recognized as rare. Danny signed the contract on a Wednesday afternoon without a lawyer present. He didn't have money for a lawyer, and nobody at Meridian suggested he get one. The contract gave the label extensive rights over his recordings, locked him in for 3 years, and paid him an advance that sounded enormous until he started calculating how long it actually had to last. He signed anyway. Of course he did. It was the door opening. What he didn't understand yet, what almost no young musician in 1971 understood, was that the door led into a building with no exits clearly marked. The recording sessions were scheduled to begin in September, giving Danny 4 months to develop material. He spent those months working harder than he ever had in Ohio, filling notebooks with chord progressions and lyrics, playing until his fingertips cracked. The discipline he'd arrived with was still there, still functioning, but it was operating alongside something else now, a new habit that had quietly installed itself into his weekly routine like a piece of software running in the background. By June, he was taking Quaaludes twice a week. By July, 3 times. The logic he used to justify this was airtight in the way that all Addict logic is airtight. It had no holes he could see from inside it. The pills helped him relax. A relaxed musician was a creative musician. He was working harder than ever, wasn't he? The evidence was right there in the notebooks. He was fine. Getting the pills required almost no effort, which was itself a kind of catastrophe. Los Angeles in the early 1970s had a medical ecosystem that operated in a grey zone so vast it was practically its own climate. Dozens of doctors along Sunset Boulevard and in the neighbouring canyons ran practices that were technically legitimate, but functionally designed to move product. They accepted cash, asked minimal questions, and were deeply familiar with the specific vocabulary of complaints that triggered a Quaalude prescription: insomnia, anxiety, muscle tension, difficulty relaxing. These were not difficult symptoms to describe. Every young person in Hollywood had them, because Hollywood was specifically engineered to produce anxiety in the people it attracted. Danny's first appointment lasted 11 minutes. He described sleeping poorly and feeling wound up before performances. The doctor, a soft-spoken man in his 50s with diplomas on every wall and a waiting room full of people who looked exactly like Danny, wrote a prescription for methaqualone without any visible internal conflict. The prescription was for 30 tablets. It took Danny less than 2 weeks to finish them. His second appointment was shorter. What Danny had no way of knowing, sitting in that waiting room in the summer of 1971, was that methaqualone had a history already dense with warning signs that the American medical establishment had chosen to largely ignore. The drug was first synthesized in India in 1951 by a researcher looking for a malaria treatment. It didn't work for malaria, but scientists noticed it had powerful sedative properties, and the pharmaceutical industry, which in the 1950s was in the middle of a love affair with the idea of chemical solutions to human discomfort, took it from there. By the early 1960s, methaqualone was being sold in Britain under the brand name Mandrax, in Germany as Somnidin, and in Japan as Hymenol. In every country where it appeared, The same pattern followed with depressing predictability. Initial enthusiasm about its medical applications, growing recreational use, escalating addiction rates, and eventually regulatory crackdown. Britain watched its youth culture develop a dangerous relationship with Mandrax through the mid-1960s. The warning was loud, clear, and well documented in international medical literature. The United States introduced Quaaludes to its market in 1965 and described them as non-addictive. This was not ignorance. The research existed. The pattern from Europe was visible to anyone who looked. But the pharmaceutical company that held the American license, William H. Rorer Inc., had a product to sell, and the American medical community had a profound institutional appetite for clean, modern, chemical solutions to the messy problem of human anxiety. The 1950s had given America Milltown. The 1960s had given it Valium. Quaaludes was simply the next iteration of the same promise. Here is a pill that will make the unbearable bearable, and it will not cost you anything. It would cost everything. Danny's recording sessions began in September as planned, and for the first few weeks they went well. His guitar work was precise and inventive, and Fitch seemed genuinely pleased with the direction of the material. The other musicians in the studio respected Danny's playing. There was a period of perhaps 3 weeks where everything appeared to be on track, where the version of the future Danny had imagined in Ohio seemed not only possible but close. Then he started bringing pills to the studio. The initial reasoning was almost logical. The studio environment was high pressure. Being watched and evaluated while playing created a specific kind of paralysis that the Quaaludes dissolved immediately. The first session where he took one beforehand went well. His playing was loose and fluid in a way that the sober sessions hadn't quite achieved. Fitch noticed and commented positively. Danny absorbed this as confirmation. The problem with using a sedative to enhance creativity is that the enhancement is an illusion with an expiration date. The drug doesn't improve the work. It improves the feeling of the work. These are different things, and the difference becomes visible to everyone except the person doing the using. By the 4th week of studio sessions, Danny was taking 2 pills before arriving, and nobody was saying his playing was fluid anymore. He missed a chord transition in a song he'd written himself. He played the wrong key change in a bridge section he'd rehearsed 200 times. He showed up 40 minutes late to a session after falling asleep in his car in the parking lot, genuinely unaware that any time had passed. Fitch said nothing immediately. He wrote things down in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, and he watched, and he waited, the way experienced industry people always do, because dropping an artist mid-session costs money, and you want to be certain before you make that call. Danny, meanwhile, had developed the specific cognitive distortion that sits at the center of every functioning addiction, the belief that the problem and the solution are the same thing. His playing was suffering because he was anxious. The pills relieved the anxiety. Therefore the pills were necessary for good playing. The fact that the pills were also the source of the suffering was a loop he could not see himself standing inside. By October, he was taking 3 pills a day. Not all before sessions. Some in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, 1 to sleep. The prescription system that had given him his first bottle was still running smoothly. 3 different doctors, rotating visits, each believing they were the only one treating him. This was not an unusual arrangement in Los Angeles in 1971. It had a name, Dr. Shopping, and it was so common that it had essentially become its own medical institution. The advance from Meridian was disappearing faster than it should have. Pills cost money, even prescription ones, and Danny had added a street source to his medical pipeline because the prescription quantities were no longer sufficient. The street price in Hollywood in 1971 was roughly $1 per tablet, which sounds cheap until you're going through 20 a week. He took on a part-time job moving equipment for a sound company on weekends, not because he needed the humility, but because he genuinely needed the cash. The studio sessions staggered forward into November. The album was supposed to take 3 months. It was already 4 months in, with less than half the material recorded. Fitch was no longer writing things down in his small notebook. He had stopped needing notes. Danny, who had arrived in Los Angeles 9 months earlier with $240 and a certainty that felt like armor, was no longer certain of anything except that he needed to get through the next few hours. The city outside kept offering its particular illusion, the palm trees lit by streetlights, the sound of parties from behind walls, the sense that something extraordinary was always happening just one room over from wherever you were standing. He was standing in the parking lot of a studio in Burbank at midnight, going through his jacket pockets with increasing urgency, and the feeling he was looking for wasn't in any of them. By the winter of 1972, the Quaalude had acquired a social life entirely separate from its pharmaceutical origins. It had names now: Ludes, Soapers, Disco Biscuits, Love Drug, each nickname reflecting a different facet of the same dangerous object, the way different people describe the same fire depending on how close they're standing. The names made it sound fun, approachable, the kind of thing you'd find at a party next to the cheese board, which was increasingly accurate. Quaaludes had migrated out of doctors' offices and into the bloodstream of Hollywood's social scene, with a speed and completeness that suggested the culture had been waiting for exactly this drug without knowing it. The parties on the Sunset Strip in 1972 operated on their own physics. Normal rules, time, consequence, professional judgment, were suspended the moment you walked through the right door. These weren't just gatherings. They were ecosystems, carefully maintained by people who understood that a room full of chemically loosened young talent was a room full of opportunity, provided you were the one who remained sober enough to recognize it. Danny had become a regular fixture in this world, which was both easier and more dangerous than it sounds. The social mechanics of the Quaalude party were specific and ritualized in ways that took Danny a few months to fully map. The drug was rarely sold at these events outright. It was given, offered with the particular generosity of people who understand that a gift creates obligation more reliably than a transaction. A producer's assistant would circulate through a party with pills in a small decorative dish, distributing them with the casual ease of someone offering mints. The message embedded in this gesture was clear even if nobody said it. We take care of the people we like. The inverse of that message was equally clear. Danny liked being taken care of. After the increasingly tense atmosphere of the Meridian recording sessions, after the slow erosion of Fitch's enthusiasm, after the general grinding pressure of being someone whose potential was constantly being evaluated and found slightly insufficient, the parties were relief. They were rooms where nobody was measuring him yet. The drug itself had developed a specific social ritual around its consumption that reflected how thoroughly it had embedded itself in the culture. People crushed tablets into wine, luding out, in a glass they called it. Others took them whole with whatever was nearby. Some people combined them with alcohol deliberately, chasing a particular edge of intoxication that both substances produced more efficiently together than either did alone. This combination was also, though most party guests either didn't know or didn't particularly care, significantly more dangerous than either substance alone. The liver processes both alcohol and methaqualone through overlapping pathways. Combined, they didn't just add together, they multiplied. Danny learned this fact approximately 18 months after he started combining them regularly. The party circuit introduced him to a cross-section of Hollywood that his music career alone never would have reached. He met session musicians who played on albums he'd grown up listening to, found himself in conversations with producers whose names appeared in liner notes he'd studied like scripture. The access felt real. It felt like the city was finally beginning to open. He didn't yet understand that there was a specific kind of access Hollywood offered to people it intended to use, and that this access looked identical from the inside to the access it offered people it intended to elevate. The difference only became clear later, and by then it was usually too late. It was at a party in the Hollywood Hills in January 1973 that Danny witnessed something that would embed itself in his memory like a splinter, small enough to ignore, positioned at exactly the angle to cause the most damage over time. The house belonged to a producer named Saul Mercer, who was significantly more powerful than Gerald Fitch and significantly less interested in music as art. Mercer threw parties twice a month that functioned as a kind of informal marketplace. Talent on one side, money and access on the other, and enough chemical lubrication to make the transaction feel organic. The rooms were beautiful. The guests were beautiful. The whole evening had the quality of something staged by someone who understood aesthetics and used them as a tool. Danny had been there perhaps 2 hours, pleasantly luded, when he noticed a girl near the back hallway. She was young, visibly young, the kind of young that reads as wrong in a room full of adults no matter how she was dressed. She'd been introduced to him earlier in the evening as an actress, a word that in 1973 Hollywood covered an enormous range of actual situations. She had the particular look of someone who had taken something that was hitting harder than expected, glassy, slow, cooperative in the involuntary way of a person whose decision-making has been chemically suspended. Mercer was guiding her toward the back of the house, not forcefully, not dramatically. With the practiced ease of a man who had done this before and understood that the most effective coercion looks, from a distance, like nothing at all. Danny watched this happen. He was aware, somewhere beneath the pharmaceutical warmth, that what he was seeing was wrong. The knowledge was there, clear, specific, morally unambiguous. He was 25 years old and not a stupid person, and he understood exactly what was occurring. The back rooms at these parties were not a mystery. People talked. Everyone knew. He turned back to the conversation he'd been having. This is the part of the Quaaludes story that the disco-era nostalgia always leaves out. The way the drug didn't just impair the people who were targeted, but also impaired the witnesses. Not just physically. Chemically, Quaaludes suppressed the parts of the brain responsible for impulse and judgment, which included the impulse to intervene, to stand up, to make a scene in a beautiful room full of powerful people. But the chemical impairment was only part of it. The other part was purely social, the calculation, performed in a fraction of a second, that intervening would cost more than it gained, that it wasn't his business, that he didn't know the full story, that someone else would handle it. Nobody handled it. The girl's name, Danny would learn much later, was Cheryl. She was 17. She had arrived in Los Angeles from Arizona 4 months earlier with a headshot and the phone number of an agent who had spotted her at a shopping mall. She did not get a film career out of that night in January 1973. She got something else entirely, something she carried for the rest of her life without ever publicly describing its weight. Danny didn't know her last name. He didn't try to find it out. He went home at 2 a.m. and took a pill to help him sleep, which struck him as reasonable. The parties continued through 1973 with the momentum of something that has grown too large to be stopped by individual conscience. The Quaalude supply chain was essentially unimpeded. Prescriptions were still flowing freely from the clinic network. Street supply was robust and cheap, and the DEA, while beginning to generate internal concern about methaqualone, had not yet moved decisively against it. The drug existed in a legal twilight zone that its users experienced as permission. What none of them could see yet was that the twilight was ending. Not because anyone in power had developed a sudden moral clarity about what was happening in those back rooms, or what was happening to Danny's hands when he tried to play guitar in the mornings. The change was coming for a simpler, more bureaucratic reason. The paperwork was starting to catch up with the reality. Congressional staffers in Washington were reading the same international research that had been available for a decade. The DEA was compiling overdose statistics that were becoming difficult to explain away. The word scheduling, the process by which a drug is formally classified as controlled, was beginning to appear in memos that eventually reached the desks of people with the authority to act on them. In Hollywood Hills, Saul Mercer threw another party. Danny went. He told himself he was going for the networking. He told himself this with complete sincerity, which is perhaps the most accurate measure of how far the disease had progressed. Not that he was lying to himself, but that he had lost the ability to locate the lie. The human body is not designed to be negotiated with indefinitely. It will accept a great deal, abuse, deprivation, chemical intrusion, and it will adapt, compensate, and absorb punishment in ways that can look, from the outside, like resilience. But the body keeps a precise and unforgiving ledger. Every adaptation has a cost. Every compensation creates a new vulnerability. And at some point, always at some point, the account comes due. For Danny Caruso, the account had been accumulating since that first night in Laurel Canyon, and by the spring of 1973 it was beginning to show in ways that couldn't be explained away. To understand what was happening inside Danny's body, you have to understand what methaqualone actually does at the neurological level. Because the destruction wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was architectural, quiet, the kind of damage that happens to the foundation while the walls still look fine. Methaqualone works primarily by targeting GABA receptors, the brain's primary inhibitory system, the network responsible for calming neural activity, reducing anxiety, and regulating the threshold between wakefulness and sleep. When methaqualone binds to these receptors, it enhances their activity dramatically, flooding the nervous system with artificial calm. This is why the drug felt like relief. It was chemically mimicking the sensation of safety in a brain that had been running on low-grade threat for months. The problem is that the brain is not passive in this process. It notices the external interference and responds by downregulating its own natural GABA production, essentially deciding with cold biological logic that if the chemical calm is being supplied externally, internal production is redundant. The brain dials back its own anxiety management system. It becomes dependent on the supplement, and when the supplement is removed, even briefly, the unmanaged anxiety doesn't return to its original level. It spikes, violently. Higher than it was before the drug ever entered the picture. This is tolerance. This is dependency. And by spring of 1973, Danny had both. 5 pills a day had become his functional baseline. Not to get high, not to feel that original warmth from the Laurel Canyon pool, but simply to feel normal. To feel like a person capable of basic tasks. 2 pills in the morning to stop his hands from trembling, 1 at lunch to maintain, 2 more in the evening to prevent the return of what he'd started calling the crawl, a full-body sensation of wrongness that arrived whenever his blood levels dropped, a feeling he could only describe as being allergic to his own skin. He was spending between $25 and $30 a day on pills. This was not 1973 money he had. The recording sessions at Meridian had deteriorated past the point of professional pretense. Danny arrived late consistently, sometimes by hours. He forgot arrangements mid-take with the specific blankness of someone whose short-term memory has been chemically erased. During one session in March, he played the opening of a song he'd written himself and then stopped, genuinely unable to remember what came next, not from nerves, not from distraction, but because the neural pathway connecting the memory of the song to his fingers had been interrupted by something he'd swallowed in the parking lot an hour earlier. The other musicians in the studio said nothing. This was also a feature of the culture. People didn't intervene, didn't confront, didn't name what they were seeing. To name it would have been to acknowledge it, and acknowledging it would have required doing something about it. And doing something about it in Hollywood in 1973 was not a thing that happened between people who might still need each other professionally. Gerald Fitch finally spoke in April. Not to Danny directly, to Meridian's business affairs department in writing, which in industry language meant he was creating documentation. The letter described the recording sessions as significantly behind schedule due to the artist's inconsistent availability and performance. It requested authorization to restructure the recording contract. The restructuring, when it came, was expressed in language so measured and corporate that a person reading quickly might miss what it actually meant. It meant they were done with him. Danny received the formal notification on a Tuesday. He read it twice, set it on his kitchen counter, took 2 pills, and spent the afternoon on his couch staring at the water stain on the ceiling that was shaped vaguely like Michigan. The notification didn't produce devastation, which was itself the most devastating part. He felt something, but it was muffled, wrapped in chemical insulation, arriving from a distance like news about someone he used to know. This is one of Quaaludes' cruelest pharmacological tricks. The drug didn't just suppress anxiety, it suppressed the emotional responses that might have driven him to act, to fight back, to feel the loss sharply enough to do something about it. The record deal that had been the entire reason for coming to Los Angeles dissolved on a Tuesday afternoon, and Danny Caruso's primary response was to take a nap. He woke up at 7 in the evening, disoriented, with a headache settling behind his left eye like a tenant who intended to stay. The guitar was in the corner where it always was. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he got up and went looking for his pill bottle, because the crawl was starting and he couldn't think about anything else until he dealt with the crawl. 4 days later, with the particular clarity that arrives during those brief windows when the chemical load drops low enough to allow genuine thought, Danny made a decision. He was going to stop. The record deal was gone. The studio sessions were over. There was nothing left to use the pills for, and the pills were eating money he didn't have. He was going to stop. He lasted 91 hours. The withdrawal that began around hour 36 was not the gradual discomfort of someone giving up caffeine or processed sugar. Methaqualone withdrawal, for someone at Danny's level of dependency, is a medical event. The brain's GABA system, which had spent 2 years outsourcing its function to an external chemical, suddenly had to operate independently again. With production capacity it had methodically reduced. The result was a nervous system running at full throttle with no brakes. The first symptom was insomnia so absolute, it felt like a physical force. Danny lay in bed for 16 hours without sleeping, his mind generating a continuous stream of fragmented, catastrophizing thoughts that he had no chemical buffer against. Then came the sweating. Not discomfort, but soaking, sheet-drenching, hour after hour sweating that left him dehydrated and shaking. His hands trembled so severely on the second day that he couldn't hold a glass of water steadily enough to drink from it. On the third day, the hallucinations arrived. They were not vivid or narrative, not the cinematic hallucinations of someone on psychedelics. They were peripheral and wrong, movements at the edge of vision that vanished when he turned toward them, sounds that had no source, a persistent sense of presence in rooms he knew were empty. His heart rate fluctuated wildly. At several points his body temperature spiked high enough that a more informed person would have taken him to an emergency room immediately. Nobody knew he was withdrawing. He hadn't told anyone. On the 91st hour, shaking and sweating in his kitchen at 3 a.m, Danny called his dealer. He was back on pills within the hour, and the relief when they hit his system was so profound that it registered not as a failure but as rescue. His body accepted the drug with the desperation of something that had been drowning and was now breathing again. He sat at his kitchen table until dawn, guitar in the corner, record deal gone, body chemistry in ruins, and made the new calculation that addicts make when the first attempt at quitting fails. That the problem wasn't the drug, but the method. He'd stopped too fast. He needed to taper. He'd do it smarter next time. There would be 8 more next times before anything actually changed, each one teaching him a progressively more expensive lesson about the distance between intention and biology. Addiction is almost never a solo performance. It requires an audience, a support structure, a small cast of people who are close enough to be affected and compromised enough to stay. Danny Caruso had such a cast by the summer of 1973, assembled not through any deliberate cruelty on his part, but through the ordinary gravitational pull of a life that has begun orbiting a single destructive centre. The people nearest to that centre got pulled in. That's not a metaphor, that's physics. Sandra Voss arrived in Danny's life through the party circuit, which by mid-1973 was essentially the only social world he inhabited. She was 22, a dancer who had trained seriously through her teens and arrived in Los Angeles with legitimate skill and the reasonable ambition of someone who has been told, repeatedly and by qualified people, that she is exceptionally good. She was. Her technical ability was real. But the entertainment industry in 1973 had a specific and limited set of uses for a woman who was an exceptional dancer, but not yet connected to anyone with the power to make that talent visible. The parties were, for Sandra, initially a professional strategy. This is important to understand. She was not naive, not lost, not looking for the wrong thing. She was networking in the only venues available to someone at her level, using the tools the culture provided. The fact that those tools included Quaaludes as a social lubricant was something she encountered gradually, and then all at once. She and Danny found each other in the way that people find each other at those parties, through proximity, through shared chemical state, through the particular intimacy that Quaaludes produced between people who might not have connected sober. The drug had a reputation as a love drug, not because it produced genuine romantic feeling, but because it dissolved the social defences that normally keep strangers at a comfortable distance. It manufactured closeness efficiently and without discrimination. What they built on top of that manufactured closeness was real enough, at least in the beginning. Danny's apartment in Silver Lake became their shared space by October 1973, not through any formal decision, but through the gradual accumulation of Sandra's belongings, until there was more of her there than anywhere else. She was warm, funny, sharply perceptive about people, and deeply committed to a version of her future that the Los Angeles she'd arrived in seemed increasingly uninterested in providing. She started using Ludes regularly around November. The progression was faster than Danny's had been, which is consistent with what research would eventually establish about methaqualone dependency. Women metabolize the drug differently, and the psychological hook tends to set with less repetition. Sandra wasn't chasing the same relief Danny had originally sought. She was chasing competence. The dance auditions she attended regularly were high pressure, harshly evaluated, frequently humiliating. A lewd before an audition took the edge off the self-consciousness that was the only thing standing between her body and what it knew how to do. She booked 2 jobs that winter. She credited the pills. This was the trap. Ray Kowalski appeared in February 1974, arriving at Danny's door with a duffel bag and the information that he'd taken a bus from Columbus, because Danny's mother had called Ray's mother and said she hadn't heard from Danny in 4 months. Ray was Danny's oldest friend. They'd grown up 3 streets apart, played in the same garage band at 16, and maintain the particular friendship of people who knew each other before ambition complicated everything. He took one look at the apartment and understood that something was severely wrong, which made him more perceptive in that moment than anyone in Danny's LA life had been in the previous year. Ray's plan was simple and good-hearted, and completely inadequate to the situation. Stay for 2 weeks, talk sense into Danny, bring him home if necessary, or at least ensure he was functional before leaving. He had a job waiting in Columbus. He had a life there, uncomplicated and small and entirely sufficient. He was 26 years old and had no particular interest in Los Angeles beyond getting his friend back. He lasted 3 weeks before someone offered him his first Quaalude. This is where the story becomes something darker than one person's downfall, because Ray's trajectory illustrated a specific and terrible truth about drug environments. You do not have to be vulnerable to become addicted. You do not need a trauma, a pressure, an anxiety that the drug specifically addresses. Sometimes you just need to be in the wrong room with the wrong people often enough, and the social pressure of a using environment does the rest. Ray had none of Danny's psychological reasons. He had no industry anxiety, no failed record deal, no burning ambition being slowly extinguished. He took the pill because someone offered it, and then he took another one because the first one felt fine, and within 6 weeks he was taking them daily. By spring of 1974, all 3 of them were using. The apartment had the specific atmosphere of a place where the primary project is maintenance, keeping the supply steady, keeping the withdrawal at bay, keeping the days manageable. Danny still talked about music. Sandra still talked about dancing. Ray talked about going back to Columbus. None of them did any of these things. The apartment became a closed system, self-referential and shrinking. Marcus Webb entered this system from the outside, which meant he was the only one with any real power in it. Marcus was 31, originally from Detroit, and had arrived in Los Angeles 7 years earlier with intentions he never specified to anyone's satisfaction. He was charming in the specific way of people who have studied charm as a professional skill, attentive, funny, able to make whoever he was talking to feel momentarily singular. He dealt primarily in methaqualone, with a sideline in cocaine for clients who wanted to diversify. His operation was mid-sized by LA standards, supplied through a network that connected to pharmaceutical diversion at multiple points, legally manufactured pills that exited the legitimate supply chain somewhere between the factory and the pharmacy. He liked Danny and Sandra and Ray in the way that a farmer likes his most productive field. He was never unkind. He extended credit when they were short, remembered their preferences, occasionally showed up with extras. The generosity was structural. It created dependency beyond the pharmacological, ensured they came back, guaranteed that the relationship was easier to maintain than to escape. Sandra began trading favors for pills in March 1974. Not with Marcus directly. Marcus was too smart to compromise the business relationship that way. The favors were with people Marcus introduced her to, at parties Marcus arranged, in rooms that operated by the same logic as the back rooms at Saul Mercer's house. She told Danny the extra pills came from a new doctor she had found. Danny didn't ask follow-up questions because some part of him didn't want the answers, and the part of him that might have demanded them had been chemically subdued. Ray stopped calling his mother in April, not because anything dramatic happened, no fight, no final breaking point. He simply ran out of the energy required to maintain the fiction that he was fine, and calling his mother required performing that fiction convincingly, and performing anything convincingly required resources he was spending elsewhere. The 4 of them, Danny, Sandra, Ray, Marcus, formed a closed economy of mutual dependence and mutual exploitation, each playing a role so specific it might have been scripted. Danny supplied the apartment and the social legitimacy of being a signed musician, even though the contract was gone and no one outside the apartment knew it. Sandra supplied income from the favor network that none of them named. Ray supplied company, and the ongoing illusion that the situation was temporary. Marcus supplied everything and charged accordingly, and watched all three of them with the patient attention of someone who understands that the most profitable relationships are the ones where the client has nowhere else to go. Danny picked up his guitar one evening in May, sober enough in that particular window between doses to feel something approaching himself. He played for about 20 minutes, runs and chord progressions, nothing arranged, just his fingers remembering what they knew. Sandra and Ray were in the next room. Neither of them came to listen. 3 years earlier, everyone in his Silver Lake house had stopped whatever they were doing when Danny played. He put the guitar down and went to find his pill bottle. Outside, Los Angeles continued its indifferent performance. The lights on the hills, the traffic on the freeway, the parties behind walls, the entire city humming along in complete ignorance of the specific disaster assembling itself in a Silver Lake apartment where a man who had once been genuinely talented was becoming a person he would not have recognized from Ohio. There is a specific kind of knowledge that a city can hold collectively, while its individual inhabitants maintain plausible ignorance. Los Angeles in 1973 and 1974 knew about Quaaludes the way it knew about a lot of things, completely in practice, and officially not at all. The drug was in the studios, in the executive suites, in the talent agencies, in the back offices of management companies. It was in the desk drawers of men who made decisions about other people's careers, and it was in the bloodstreams of the people those decisions were made about. The power dynamic this created was not subtle. It was simply never named. The clinic network that supplied Danny and thousands like him had expanded dramatically by 1974. Sunset Boulevard alone had several practices that functioned as essentially pharmaceutical vending machines, the only meaningful barrier between a patient and a prescription being the time it took to describe the appropriate symptoms. The doctors running these operations were not cartoon villains. Several of them genuinely believed they were providing a service, managing the anxiety of a population that the entertainment industry systematically ground into powder. The road to a prescription mill, it turned out, was paved with clinical rationalization. One clinic on Fountain Avenue wrote over 400 methaqualone prescriptions in a single month in early 1974. The DEA would later document this number during an investigation. At the time, it was simply business. The scale of what was happening became visible only when you stepped back far enough to see the whole shape of it. Individual cases look like personal failures. Danny's lost record deal, Sandra's compromised auditions, Ray's abandoned return to Ohio. Zoom out, and the personal failures resolved into a pattern that was systemic, deliberate, and substantially enabled by people with far more power than any of its victims. The use of Quaaludes as a tool of exploitation in the entertainment industry was not incidental to the drug's Hollywood history. It was central to it. The drug's specific pharmacological profile, the way it produced compliance and cooperation, the way it suspended judgment and resistance while leaving the subject apparently conscious and functional, made it useful to predatory people in ways that alcohol, for all its ubiquity, was not. A person who was drunk was visibly, obviously impaired. A person who was lewded out could hold a conversation, walk without obvious difficulty, and appear to be making voluntary choices while being pharmacologically incapable of the kind of evaluation that genuine choice requires. This distinction was understood, not publicly, not in documents that anyone was writing down at the time, but it was understood in the way that useful tools are understood by the people who use them. The producers and managers and label executives who circulated through the party network were not all predators. The ecosystem included genuine music lovers, legitimate deal makers, people who attended those parties for exactly the reasons they claimed. But the predators used the legitimate majority as cover, the way dangerous things always use normal things as camouflage. The party was real. The networking was real. The Quaaludes in the decorative dish were real, and the back rooms were also real, and the men who knew which young people had taken enough to make the back room viable were real, and the calculation they performed was as cold and deliberate as any business decision. Danny knew this. Knew it the way he'd known it watching Cheryl being guided down the hallway at Mercer's party in January 1973. The knowledge lived in him as a persistent low-frequency shame, separate from his addiction, independent of the chemicals, something that could surface even in the brief windows of relative clarity between doses. He was not the only one who knew and said nothing. The knowing and saying nothing was nearly universal among the people who moved through that world regularly. A musician who made a scene at a producer's party did not get called for sessions. An actress who reported what happened in a back room did not get cast. The industry's enforcement of its own silence was not dramatic or explicit. It operated through the simple withdrawal of opportunity, which in a city built entirely on the promise of opportunity was the most effective enforcement mechanism imaginable. Congress had begun generating noise about methaqualone in 1973, driven partly by international pressure and partly by overdose statistics that were becoming impossible to dismiss. The drug was placed on Schedule II in 1973, the same category as cocaine and morphine, which tightened prescription requirements significantly, without eliminating the clinic network that had already perfected the art of operating within technical legal boundaries while violating their spirit completely. Danny read about the scheduling in a newspaper. He was sitting at his kitchen table on a Thursday morning, 3 pills already in his system, and the article registered as interesting information about a subject that was, from where he was sitting, entirely theoretical. The scheduling didn't affect Marcus. It didn't affect the clinic on Fountain Avenue, at least not immediately. It didn't affect the party network or the decorative dishes or the back rooms. It affected the paperwork, which was a different thing from the reality, and in the gap between paperwork and reality was where the entire machinery of Hollywood's Quaalude culture continued to operate without interruption. What the scheduling did do, with a lag of several months, was drive up the street price. Pills that had cost $1 each in 1972 cost $3 by late 1973 and were trending upward. The supply chain adapted. More pharmaceutical diversion, more counterfeit product from Mexico, more pressure on the network of compliant doctors to maintain output through increasingly creative prescribing. The increase in price hit Danny and Sandra and Ray in the most direct possible way. Their daily habit now cost significantly more than it had, applied to a financial situation that was already operating at negative capacity. Sandra's favor network expanded to compensate. Danny sold his amplifier, then 2 of his guitars, not the Stratocaster, not yet, but 2 others he'd acquired during the Meridian period. Ray began doing occasional work for Marcus, running deliveries to addresses he didn't ask questions about, which paid better than anything else he'd found and required approximately the moral engagement of picking up dry cleaning, at least if you worked hard at not examining it too closely. Marcus observed all of this with the satisfaction of a man whose business model was functioning exactly as designed. His clients were self-sustaining in their dependency and flexible in their willingness to generate revenue to feed it. He had not created this situation. The industry had created it long before Marcus arrived, using its own tools. He had simply identified the opportunity and capitalized on it, with the entrepreneurial energy that Los Angeles, above all other cities, was supposed to celebrate. The DEA field office in Los Angeles was, by late 1974, aware of several specific clinic operations and a handful of mid-level distributors. Marcus was on a list. He was not at the top of the list, which in practice meant he was not the current priority, which meant he continued operating while investigators worked their way up from the bottom. The bureaucratic patience of law enforcement, when applied to drug networks, tends to protect the people in the middle, while the people at the bottom, the users, the runners, the people doing deliveries for cash, absorb whatever enforcement pressure exists. Ray was doing deliveries. Danny didn't connect these facts into a picture because connecting facts into pictures requires sustained cognitive function that 5 pills a day systematically prevents. The pieces were all present. The DEA interest, Marcus's position on a list somewhere, Ray's exposure, the escalating price pressure pushing all 3 of them toward increasingly risky behavior. They were all in the same room, pointing in the same direction. The thing about systems moving toward catastrophe is that they rarely announce the approach. The pressure builds in places that aren't visible until something gives, and then everything happens at once, and people standing in the wreckage describe it as sudden, even though every element was in place for months. In the Silver Lake apartment, the guitar sat in the corner untouched. Outside, the city that had promised Danny Caruso everything continued its performance, indifferent and luminous and entirely unaware that the bill was almost due. It happened on a Tuesday in November 1974, which is the kind of mundane detail that real catastrophes always have and dramatized ones never do. There was no party, no dramatic escalation, no moment of operatic excess that could serve as a clean narrative cause. Sandra had been home all day. Danny had gone out in the morning to see Marcus and returned around noon. Ray had been sleeping on the couch since the previous evening, which had stopped being unusual approximately 6 months earlier. The apartment had a peculiar silence, typical of places where people have nothing left to say to each other. Somewhere early in the day, Danny noticed that she hadn't emerged from the bathroom for 20 minutes. He noticed again after 20 minutes. He noticed again after 40. The particular awareness that something was wrong arrived not as alarm but as a slow, dawning wrongness, the way bad news sometimes approaches, giving you just enough time to brace before it hits. He knocked. No response. He tried the handle, found it unlocked and opened the door. Sandra was on the floor. Not dramatically. Not the way overdoses look in films, with the lighting and the stillness calibrated for emotional impact. She was simply on the floor of the bathroom in a position that suggested she had slid down from the edge of the tub, and her breathing was audible but wrong, shallow, irregular, with a rattling quality that had no business being in a 23-year-old woman's chest. Danny's first response, and this is important, this is what addiction does to a person's priorities, was to check how many pills were visible in the apartment before calling for help. He spent perhaps 90 seconds doing this. 90 seconds is a very long time when someone is on a bathroom floor not breathing correctly. Ray called the ambulance. Danny was still in the hallway, moving things. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes and worked on Sandra in the bathroom doorway, with the focused efficiency of people who'd seen this specific situation many times and had strong opinions about it. They stabilized her enough to move her. The ambulance left with lights going. Ray followed in a cab. Danny stood in the apartment for a moment, surrounded by the wreckage of the afternoon, and then followed. The hospital waiting room was a different kind of Los Angeles than the one Danny had been living in. Fluorescent, undecorated, populated by people in various states of distress who had not chosen to be there and were not pretending to be having a good time. Danny sat in a plastic chair and waited, and the withdrawal started. He had last taken a pill at around 11 that morning. It was now past 6 in the evening. For a person at his level of dependency, 7 hours without methaqualone was enough to initiate the process. Not the full catastrophe he'd experienced during his 91-hour attempt the previous year, but the unmistakable beginning of it. The anxiety arrived first, spiking far beyond anything his natural neurochemistry would have produced. Then the sweating. Then a tremor in his hands that he pressed between his knees so the other people in the waiting room wouldn't see it. He sat with this for 11 hours. Ray sat beside him for the first 4, then fell asleep in his chair with the boneless completeness of a person whose body has simply overridden everything else. Danny didn't sleep. He couldn't have slept if the hospital had provided a bed and a sedative. His nervous system was running at a frequency that sleep couldn't reach. So he sat and he sweated through his shirt and he thought, and the thinking was different from anything he'd experienced in the last 2 years because there was nothing between him and it. Unmedicated thought, after 2 years of chemical insulation, was a brutal and clarifying experience. The facts of his situation arrived without the softening that the pills usually provided. No record deal, no music, no money. Sandra on the other side of a set of swinging doors because of something she'd swallowed in a bathroom they shared. Ray asleep next to him, a person who'd come to California to save his friend and had instead developed his own methaqualone dependency in the process. The guitar in the corner of the apartment that nobody played anymore. The specific weight of Cheryl, the girl at Mercer's party, the back hallway, the decision to turn away, arrived somewhere around 2 a.m. with a clarity that the pills had kept manageable for almost 2 years. It wasn't manageable at 2 a.m. in a hospital waiting room without chemical assistance. It sat on his chest like something with mass. A doctor came out at 3 a.m. and said that Sandra was stable, which is the medical way of saying she had not died, which is a different thing from saying she was going to be fine. She had mixed methaqualone and alcohol, a combination her liver had processed hundreds of times before, but quantity and frequency had been escalating for months, and the body, as previously discussed, keeps a ledger. Her system had simply reached the point where the ledger demanded payment in full. She spent 3 days in the ICU. The withdrawal hit Danny in full force on the 2nd day. What had begun as tremors and anxiety progressed through the night into something that occupied every register of human suffering simultaneously. His temperature spiked. The hallucinations returned, the peripheral wrongness, the sourceless sounds, but more insistent this time, harder to dismiss. At one point he was certain there was someone standing in the corner of the men's room who was not there when he turned to look directly. His heart rate was documented by a nurse who came to check on him after he asked for help at the desk, and the number she read from the monitor produced a look on her face that people are trained not to show patience. He was dehydrated, febrile, and experiencing withdrawal from a Schedule II controlled substance in a hospital waiting room, because going to a doctor meant explaining why, and explaining why meant accounting for the pills, and accounting for the pills meant having a conversation he was not prepared to have. He had this conversation anyway, involuntarily, when his legs gave out in the corridor on the morning of the 2nd day, and an orderly found him on the floor, and a doctor appeared with the specific no-nonsense calm of someone who has pieced together the situation from available evidence and doesn't require confession to proceed. They gave him something to manage the withdrawal. Not methaqualone, nothing that would continue the dependency, but enough to prevent a seizure and bring his vital signs back to a range that didn't constitute an emergency. He slept for 14 hours in a hospital bed down the hall from Sandra, separated from her by walls and circumstance, and 2 years of accumulated damage that had finally run out of places to hide. When Sandra woke up on the 3rd day, she was told she had a visitor. She said she didn't want to see him. The nurse relayed this information to Danny with professional neutrality, and he received it the same way. Standing in a corridor smelling of industrial cleaner and recycled air, in clothes he'd been wearing for 3 days, sober in a way that felt less like health and more like exposure. Ray had gone back to the apartment at some point. Danny didn't know exactly when. He walked out of the hospital on the morning of the 4th day into November sunshine that had the particular quality of Southern California winter light, bright without warmth, illuminating without comforting, showing you everything clearly without making any of it easier to look at. He stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital entrance and took a full inventory of his situation. 27 years old, no record deal, no working relationship with music, no money beyond what he could borrow or scavenge. A body that had just spent 4 days trying to expel a 2-year chemical dependency and was nowhere near finished with that project. A girlfriend who didn't want to see him from her hospital bed. A best friend who had come to save him and ended up on the same floor. And somewhere in a Silver Lake apartment, a guitar in a corner that nobody had played in months. The city offered him nothing in that moment. No promise, no proximity to greatness, no sense of something enormous just one room over. Los Angeles, stripped of chemical mediation, was just a city. Concrete and palm trees and traffic, and the indifferent movement of people going places he wasn't going. He started walking. He didn't have a destination. He just needed to move in some direction that wasn't back. The Eastside Recovery Center on Cesar Chavez Avenue did not look like salvation. It looked like what it was, a county-funded facility operating on a budget that prioritized function over comfort, staffed by people who had chosen this work not for its glamour, but for reasons that tended to be personal and specific. The waiting area had plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a television mounted too high on the wall, and a smell compounded of industrial cleaner, old coffee, and the particular human scent of people in various stages of coming apart. There were no plants. The lighting was the kind that makes everyone look slightly unwell, which in this context was at least accurate. Danny checked himself in on a Friday morning, 12 days after walking out of the hospital. Those 12 days deserve a moment of attention, because they were not a clean narrative bridge between crisis and recovery. They were 12 days of Danny Caruso using methaqualone at a reduced level, not because he had a tapering plan, but because Marcus had heard about Sandra's overdose through the network and had, with the particular self-protective instinct of someone who understands liability, briefly made himself harder to reach. The reduced supply produced reduced consumption. The reduced consumption produced intermittent clarity. The intermittent clarity produced eventually the decision to walk into the Eastside Recovery Center on a Friday morning and tell the woman at the intake desk that he needed help. Saying those words out loud was the hardest thing he had done since arriving in California. The intake process was thorough and unhurried in a way that felt almost disorienting after years of a lifestyle organized around instant chemical gratification. Forms, questions, a medical evaluation that documented his dependency level with clinical precision. The nurse who conducted it had seen hundreds of methaqualone cases and approached his without drama or judgment, which he found both relieving and somehow more confronting than judgment would have been. She assessed him as a high-dependency case requiring medically supervised withdrawal before he could begin any behavioral program. The medically supervised withdrawal took 9 days. It was not the unmanaged catastrophe of his previous attempts. The medical team knew what they were doing. They had protocols, medications to manage the seizure risk and the cardiovascular volatility, staff who checked on him at intervals calibrated to his specific risk profile. The physical suffering was still significant. The sweating, the insomnia, the crawling anxiety that had no object and no ceiling. But it was suffering with containment around it, which changes the experience in ways that are hard to articulate until you've experienced the alternative. The difference between drowning in open water and drowning in a swimming pool is that in the pool, the walls are right there. He didn't sleep properly for the first 6 days. On the 7th, he slept for 11 hours and woke up feeling scraped empty. Not well, not recovered, but genuinely himself in a way he hadn't been in long enough that the sensation was unfamiliar. The behavioral program began in the 2nd week. It was structured around group sessions, individual counselling, and a daily schedule so regimented it felt almost punitive. Meals at fixed times, activities at fixed times, lights out at a fixed time, The entire day organised around the principle that a mind without structure will find its way back to the thing that used to organise it. Danny resisted the structure instinctively at first, the way people who have been living on their own terms resist any external imposition, even one they have voluntarily sought. The other patients dismantled that resistance without trying to. They were not the population Danny would have predicted for a county rehab facility in East Los Angeles. There was a 43-year-old school administrator who had developed a Quaalude dependency after her doctor prescribed them for insomnia following her divorce. A 20-year-old whose entry point had been the exact same party circuit Danny had travelled. A Vietnam veteran whose relationship with methaqualone had begun at a VA hospital where the drug was used, with breathtaking institutional carelessness to manage PTSD. They were ordinary people whose ordinary vulnerabilities had been met by an extraordinarily efficient molecule, and sitting in group sessions with them recalibrated something in Danny's understanding of what had happened to him. He had spent 2 years thinking of his addiction as a personal failure specific to his particular weaknesses. The group sessions made clear that the failure, to the extent it existed, was distributed across a much larger system. The pharmaceutical company that lied about addiction risk, the doctors who prescribed without monitoring, the industry that used the drug as a social and predatory tool, the regulatory bodies that had the information to act years before they did. This was not an excuse, but it was a context, and context turned out to matter more than Danny would have expected. Victor Reyes ran the Tuesday and Thursday group sessions, and he was the most important person Danny met in that building. Victor was 40, a former heroin addict who had been clean for 11 years and had the specific authority that comes from having been exactly where his patients were and having found a way out that he could describe from memory rather than theory. He was not warm in the conventional sense. He didn't traffic in reassurance or easy positivity. He had a directness that could feel brutal until you realized it was the first honest engagement some of his patients had experienced in years. He told Danny something in their first individual session that landed differently than anything Danny had heard in 2 years of using, or in the 12 days between the hospital and the intake desk, or in the 9 days of managed withdrawal. He said that getting clean was the easy part, relatively speaking. The hard part was staying clean in a world that would not acknowledge the effort, would not celebrate the absence of the thing, would not give Danny a single external marker of the war he was fighting internally every day. Fame, Victor said, at least gave you applause. Recovery gave you nothing but your own life, and most people, when they first got it back, weren't sure they wanted it. Danny thought about this for 3 days before deciding Victor was right. The skills the program tried to build were unglamorous to the point of absurdity given the context. How to sleep without chemical assistance, the specific behavioural techniques of sleep hygiene that Danny had never needed before because he'd been unconscious since 16 on guitar or pills. How to manage anxiety using physical methods, exercise, breath, the particular grounding techniques that work by pulling the nervous system out of its catastrophizing loop and back into the body. How to structure a day when the day no longer has a pharmaceutical architecture holding it together. These were not skills that anyone in Hollywood would have celebrated. They were not the kind of growth that gets written about or rewarded or noticed by the people Danny had come to Los Angeles to impress. They were invisible skills for an invisible war, and developing them required showing up every day to something that looked, from the outside, exactly like nothing. Danny showed up. Not perfectly. There was a Tuesday in week 4 where he didn't get out of bed for group, spending the morning on his cot staring at the ceiling, and Victor came and sat in the chair beside the cot without speaking for 10 minutes, and then left, and Danny got up and went to the session. There was a Thursday where he walked to the edge of the facility's property and stood on the sidewalk for 20 minutes, genuinely uncertain whether he was going to walk back in or walk away, and the calculation that brought him back was not noble or clear-eyed. It was simply that he had nowhere else to go that wasn't worse. But he stayed. He attended the sessions. He completed the program's 42 days, and then, because he had no stable housing situation, and the counsellors assessed his community support as insufficient for safe, independent discharge, he stayed for another 3 weeks in a transitional arrangement that the facility offered for exactly these cases. The Stratocaster was still in the Silver Lake apartment. He didn't know the current status of the apartment, whether Ray was still there, whether the rent was paid, whether his belongings were intact. He thought about the guitar sometimes, in the evenings after dinner when the day's sessions were done and the facility was quiet. He didn't know if he wanted to play again. He didn't know if the hands that had been his primary identity for 15 years were still capable of producing what they once could. He knew he was clean. He knew what day it was. He knew what he had eaten for breakfast, which sounds like nothing and is actually everything when you've spent 2 years in a chemical fog. Victor told him, on his last formal session before discharge, that the work he'd done in the previous 8 weeks was real, and it was good, and that the next part, the part outside these walls, in the city that had taken everything from him, was where he'd find out what the work was actually worth. Danny walked out of the Eastside Recovery Center on a Thursday morning into the same Southern California winter light that had shown him nothing outside the hospital 6 weeks earlier. It looked different now, not warmer, not more promising. Los Angeles had not changed its terms, but he was seeing it with different equipment, and that turned out to matter more than the city's willingness to cooperate. He took a bus back towards Silver Lake. He had $63 and a program discharge document, and the address of an outpatient support group that met on Monday and Wednesday evenings. He also had somewhere in a third-floor apartment that might or might not still contain his belongings, a guitar he hadn't touched in months. The bus moved through the city. Around him, Los Angeles performed its usual indifferent spectacle. The billboards, the traffic, the people moving through their days with the focused opacity of people who have their own problems. Nobody on the bus knew where he'd been. Nobody was watching. The war he'd just survived had left no visible marks that a stranger could read. That was the thing about this particular fight. You won it entirely in private, or you didn't win it at all. The Silver Lake apartment was empty when Danny got back. Not ransacked, not dramatically cleared out, just empty in the way that spaces become when people have left them gradually, taking things in increments until what remains is the negative shape of the life that used to occupy the room. Ray's duffel bag was gone. The Stratocaster was intact. He sat on the floor beside it for a while without picking it up, the way you sit beside someone you haven't seen in a long time before you know what to say. The landlord accepted 2 weeks back rent without asking questions, which suggested Ray had at least maintained that much before leaving. The apartment was paid through the end of the month. After that, Danny's $63 and the problem of the next month's rent would require a solution that music alone was unlikely to provide in the immediate term. He found a job within the week, not in music, not adjacent to music, not in any zip code of the entertainment industry. He found it through a notice on a community board at the outpatient support group. A position as a general assistant for a small recording studio in Burbank that did commercial work, jingles, industrial training videos, the unglamorous infrastructure of an industry that needed audio for everything but only celebrated a fraction of it. The pay was minimal, the hours were long, the work involved moving equipment, cleaning consoles, running errands for session musicians who were doing in a day what Danny had spent years trying to do for keeps. He took it without hesitation. This required a specific recalibration of identity that was more difficult than it sounds. Danny had arrived in Los Angeles as an artist. He had a demo tape, a signed contract, a self-concept built around being the person at the center of the creative process. Working as an assistant, fetching coffee for session players, coiling cables, taking lunch orders, required him to occupy a position in the room that was structurally opposite to the one he'd imagined. Every day was a small exercise in swallowing pride he'd spent years building. He did it anyway, because the alternative was returning to the party circuit, and the party circuit was still exactly what it had been, unchanged and patient, waiting for the people it had temporarily lost. The outside world was, in fact, shifting in ways that clarified what Danny had been living inside. The DEA's crackdown on methaqualone prescriptions, sharpened by the 1973 scheduling, had created a pharmaceutical drought that was forcing the street market to adapt in real time. By 1975, the legitimate domestic supply of methaqualone had been significantly curtailed. The clinic network that had given Danny his first prescription in 11 minutes was under investigation. Several of the prescribing doctors lost their licenses in proceedings that generated small notices in newspapers and enormous relief in the DEA offices that had spent 3 years building the cases. The drug didn't disappear. It never disappeared. It simply became harder to obtain legitimately, which drove users to the street market, which was supplied increasingly by product manufactured in Mexico and, later, South Africa. Batches of variable quality and composition that made overdose significantly more likely because the dose in any given tablet was no longer predictable. The people most harmed by this transition were the ones who had been dependent longest, whose tolerance was highest, and whose judgment was most impaired. The crackdown protected future users at the cost of leaving current ones in a more dangerous supply environment. Danny watched this transition from the outside, newly sober, with the specific clarity of someone who can see the machinery of a trap, now that he's no longer inside it. The party culture absorbed the methaqualone shortage with the adaptive resilience of something that had never really been about any specific drug. By 1975, cocaine had moved from being an expensive luxury consumed by the industry's upper tier to being the dominant chemical of the Sunset Strip scene at every level. It was everywhere, on glass surfaces in bathrooms at every major venue, in the green rooms of recording studios, at the parties that continued in the same houses with the same guest lists and the same power dynamics and the same back rooms, now serviced by a different molecule. The switch from Quaaludes to cocaine changed the aesthetic of the scene without changing its structure. Where Ludes had produced compliance and sedation, cocaine produced energy and grandiosity, a different kind of impairment, less obviously incapacitating, in some ways more dangerous because users felt operational and sharp, while making decisions that were neither. The same producers who had circulated pills in decorative dishes were now cutting lines on expensive surfaces and offering them with the same proprietary generosity. The gift that creates obligation doesn't require a consistent chemical formula. It just requires that you keep giving. Danny encountered this world at the edges of his new job. The commercial studio where he worked occasionally hosted sessions for artists in active recording contracts, and those sessions sometimes had the particular social atmosphere of the party circuit transplanted into a professional setting. He learned to leave the room during breaks. Not dramatically. He didn't make announcements or create distance in ways that required explanation. He just found reasons to be elsewhere, and the reasons were always legitimate enough that nobody questioned them. This is one of the practical skills that Victor had described, and that Danny now understood from application. The art of removing yourself from a dangerous environment without making the removal into a confrontation. Confrontation required energy and produced social friction. Simple, consistent absence required only the habit of finding somewhere else to be. Gerald Fitch appeared once at a session in the Burbank studio, and they occupied the same room for 40 minutes without Fitch giving any sign that he recognized Danny. This was either deliberate or genuine. The industry's ability to forget people it no longer needed was thorough enough that either was plausible. Danny noticed. examined his own reaction to being unrecognised by the man who had terminated his record deal, and found something that resembled indifference. Not the chemical indifference of 2 pills before lunch. Something quieter and more durable. The support group meetings on Monday and Wednesday evenings were, for the first year, the most important hours of his week. The group met in the basement of a church in Los Feliz, folding tables, bad coffee, people at various stages of the same journey, whose company provided the specific reassurance that the thing you're going through has been gone through before and survived. Danny listened more than he spoke for the first 6 months, which was a reversal of his previous approach to most situations and turned out to be productive. He heard things in those meetings that rearranged his understanding of his own experience. A woman who described how her dependency had made her invisible to herself, how she'd lost not just function, but the capacity to know what she actually wanted, what she actually felt, what she actually thought beneath the chemical overlay. A man who described getting clean as finding a stranger living in his body and having to decide whether to keep him. The language people used for their own transformations was often more precise than clinical terminology because it came from the inside. Danny had been clean for 8 months when he picked up the Stratocaster and played something that wasn't an exercise or a remembered song. It was new, fragmentary, incomplete, rough in the way that things are when they've been locked in a room for 2 years. But it was his, unmistakably, in a way that nothing he'd recorded during the Meridian period had entirely been. He didn't tell anyone about this. He played alone in the apartment, the same apartment that had been the epicenter of the collapse, now stripped of its population and its pharmaceutical infrastructure, and its particular atmosphere of managed desperation. The rooms were just rooms now. The guitar was just a guitar. And the music, when it came, was just music. Not a career strategy, not a self-medication method, not a performance for an industry audience. It was the thing itself playing for nobody in an empty room at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Outside, Los Angeles was still performing. The Strip was still lit. The parties were still running, now with different chemistry but identical architecture. New 24-year-olds were arriving on buses from Ohio and Texas and Florida, with demo tapes and leather jackets, and the specific confidence that only exists before reality weighs in. The city was preparing to do to them what it had done to Danny, and to the people before Danny, and to the people before them, not out of malice, but out of structure, because the structure had never been examined seriously enough to be changed. Danny played until midnight, then set the guitar in the corner and went to sleep at a time a functioning person would go to sleep, which was itself a form of victory that nobody would ever see or celebrate or understand from the outside. He was 28 years old. He had been in Los Angeles for 4 years. He was alive, which was not guaranteed, and sober, which was not permanent without daily maintenance, and employed, which was not glamorous. It was, by any reasonable accounting, enough. News about people you've used with doesn't arrive cleanly. It comes in fragments, through third parties, in the middle of conversations about something else entirely. A casual mention at a support group, a sentence from someone who knew someone, a name surfacing in a context that requires you to reassemble the person around it. Danny learned what happened to the people in his orbit the same way he'd learned most things in the last few years. Slowly, incompletely, and later than he should have. Sandra he heard about first, through a woman at the Wednesday support group who had overlapped briefly with the same party circuit. Sandra had been discharged from the hospital in December 1974, 3 weeks after her overdose, into a situation that had the same address but none of the same occupants. Danny was in the Eastside Recovery Centre. Ray was gone. The apartment was empty. She'd stayed there for 2 weeks alone, using intermittently, before something shifted. Not a dramatic second bottom, not another medical event, but a quieter and in some ways more decisive moment that the woman at the support group described only as Sandra deciding she was done with Los Angeles. She left in January 1975, drove north up the coast in a car that barely made the trip, stopped in Portland because she knew someone there from her dance training years, and stayed. She got clean through an outpatient program attached to a Portland hospital. She started teaching dance to children at a community center, not the career she'd imagined, nothing adjacent to the industry she'd come to Los Angeles to enter, but work that used what her body knew and gave it back to people who hadn't yet had it damaged by anything. She didn't contact Danny. He didn't expect her to. The relationship had been built substantially on shared chemical state, and what remained when the chemical was removed was two people who had watched each other deteriorate without intervening, which is a foundation that most people correctly identify as insufficient. He was glad she was alive. That was real and uncomplicated and enough. Ray's story arrived through Danny's mother, who had maintained a quiet information network with Ray's mother throughout the entire California period. Two women in Ohio exchanging updates about their sons with the particular restraint of people who know more than they're saying and are protecting each other from the worst of it. Danny called his mother for the first time in 14 months in the spring of 1975 from a payphone outside the Burbank studio, and the conversation lasted an hour and covered 4 years of accumulated distance in the careful way that conversations do, when both people are aware that honesty, applied too quickly, can do more damage than the silence it replaces. Ray had made it back to Columbus in early 1975. The return was not triumphant. He was visibly diminished, thinner, slower, with a slight tremor in his left hand that his mother initially attributed to cold and eventually understood was something else. He moved back into his childhood bedroom at 27 and spent 3 months barely leaving the house while his body renegotiated its relationship with normal neurochemistry. The tremor didn't go away. A neurologist in Columbus examined Ray in the summer of 1975 and explained that the repeated methaqualone withdrawal seizures, the ones Ray had experienced during his various attempts to quit in the Silver Lake apartment, the ones Danny had been only dimly aware of because his own chemical state had made observation unreliable, had caused measurable neurological damage. The seizures had fired repeatedly in Ray's brain without proper medical management, and the tissue had recorded each one. He was 27 years old with the neurological footnotes of someone considerably older, and the epilepsy that resulted would require medication and monitoring for the rest of his life. Danny sat with this information for several days. The weight of it was specific and located, not general guilt about the period, but the precise and targeted knowledge that Ray had come to California to help him, had been drawn into the same destruction, and was now carrying physical damage that had Danny's fingerprints on it in ways that couldn't be argued away. The drug had done it. The environment had done it. But Danny had been the environment's invitation, and that distinction, however defensible logically, provided no actual relief. Marcus Webb was dead. This arrived through the support group network, through someone who had known Marcus peripherally, in a single sentence delivered without particular emphasis, because the person delivering it hadn't known Marcus well enough to understand the sentence's full weight. Marcus had been found in the parking lot of a bar in Hollywood in the spring of 1976, not from an overdose, not from anything pharmaceutical, but from a dispute over money that had involved a third party and a knife, and the kind of conclusion that mid-level drug distribution sometimes reaches when the accounting between people becomes irreconcilable. Danny felt almost nothing about this, which troubled him more than grief would have. Marcus had been the mechanism of significant harm to 3 people Danny cared about, and yet he had also been genuinely charming, genuinely intelligent, and genuinely present in a period of Danny's life when presence of any kind had felt like sustenance. The absence of clean feeling about Marcus's death No relief, no sorrow, just a kind of complicated flatness, seemed like the most honest response available, and Danny distrusted it anyway. He brought it to Victor, who he still saw occasionally for individual sessions even 2 years after leaving the facility. Victor listened and said that ambivalence about the death of someone who harmed you was not a moral failure. It was just the accurate emotional response to a person who'd been both harmful and human, and most people fell into that category if you knew them long enough. The information about Cheryl came last and worst. Danny had not actively searched for it. He had spent 2 years carefully not searching for it, which is a different thing from not thinking about it. The girl from Mercer's party, 17 years old, guided down a hallway while lewded out, while Danny turned back to his conversation, had occupied a specific corner of his conscience since the hospital waiting room at 2 a.m, when the pills were out of his system and the weight of things arrived without insulation. A journalist Danny met briefly at the Burbank studio was working on a piece about the exploitation of the young talent in the entertainment industry, one of the first such pieces to be written seriously, years before the cultural conversation caught up with the reality. The journalist had interviewed several women who had been through the party circuit in the early 1970s. During a casual exchange, she mentioned a name, not Cheryl, a different woman, whose story overlapped with a detail Danny recognized from that January night in 1973. He asked a careful question. The journalist answered it. Cheryl had not become an actress. She had gone back to Arizona within months of that night, carrying something she never fully described to anyone in terms that became public record. She had struggled. The details beyond that were not the journalist to share, and Danny didn't press, because some part of him understood that pressing was about his need for resolution, rather than any genuine right to information about a person he had failed completely at a critical moment. He had turned back to his conversation. She'd gone through a doorway. These were the two facts, separated by 30 feet, and a calculation he had made in a fraction of a second, and no amount of subsequent sobriety or self-examination could revise them. Victor had told him, months earlier, that guilt was useful precisely as long as it was motivating change and useless the moment it became a substitute for it. Danny understood the logic. He applied it imperfectly, the way most people apply correct logic to their own worst moments, genuinely, incompletely, repeatedly. He was 2 years sober by the summer of 1976. The job at the Burbank studio had evolved incrementally. He was now doing minor technical work in addition to the assistant duties, having absorbed enough knowledge about recording equipment through proximity and attention to be genuinely useful in the booth. It wasn't the career he had come to Los Angeles to have. It was employment with dignity and a skill set that was growing, which turned out to be its own category of thing. The Stratocaster was no longer in the corner. It was on a stand beside his bed, played most evenings, tuned carefully, and maintained with the attention of someone who had learned the cost of neglecting things that matter. He wasn't writing songs for a record deal. He wasn't writing songs for an audience. He was writing them for the same reason he'd started playing guitar at 11 in Ohio, because the music was there and he was capable of reaching it, and that was sufficient justification. One evening in August 1976, sitting on the floor of his apartment with the guitar in his lap and the windows open to the warm night air, Danny thought about all the versions of the Los Angeles story he'd been sold before arriving. The record deal, the famous friends, the parties where opportunity circulated like weather, the version of himself that was supposed to emerge from all of it, polished and successful and validated by the city's specific machinery of recognition. None of it had happened. Every specific thing he'd come for had been taken, or had failed, or had turned out to be a mechanism of harm rather than a path to anything real. And yet here he was, playing guitar in a Silver Lake apartment, 2 years clean, employed, alive, which is a word that in the context of the story he'd just lived through carried significantly more weight than it does in ordinary usage. The people in his orbit had paid prices he hadn't. Ray's trembling hand in Columbus, Sandra teaching dance to children in Portland because Los Angeles had burned the more ambitious version of her future to the ground, Cheryl in Arizona with whatever she was carrying, Marcus in a parking lot. The city outside the open window was still running its performance. The strip was lit. The parties continued. The industry kept manufacturing its particular blend of promise and predation with the efficiency of something that had been optimized over decades. New people were arriving daily, stepping off buses with demo tapes, convinced they were the exception. Danny set the guitar on its stand, closed the window against the night air, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. He didn't dream about Ohio anymore. History has a way of glamorizing the decades it's finished with. The 1970s, viewed from sufficient distance, become an aesthetic. The colours, the fashion, the music, the particular visual texture of a decade that produced some of the most significant art in American history. The Sunset Strip in retrospect looks like a film set. All warm light and iconic faces and the romantic chaos of an era before everything became corporate and calculated. The parties look fun. The drugs look like accessories. The excess looks like freedom. The people who actually lived through it know a different version. They carry it in their bodies, in their neurological damage, in the specific silence they maintain when someone younger describes the 1970s as a golden era they wish they could have experienced. Danny Caruso was 31 years old in 1978, working as a recording engineer at a mid-sized studio in Burbank that did a mix of commercial and artistic work. The ascent from assistant to engineer had taken 3 years and had happened not through any dramatic breakthrough, but through the steady accumulation of competence and reliability. 2 qualities so rare in the entertainment industry that they functioned almost as superpowers. He showed up on time. He did what he said he would do. He remembered things from session to session without needing to be reminded. These were not extraordinary qualities. In the context of an industry structured around volatility and self-destruction, they were extraordinary. He'd been clean for 4 years. The counting of years mattered in the support group world in ways that the outside world didn't understand or particularly care about. 4 years represented 4 years of daily decisions, accumulated in the specific silence of a private war that generated no external recognition. Nobody gave Danny an award for 4 years. Nobody threw a party. The city that had watched him implode had not been watching his reconstruction, and would not have known what it was looking at if it had been. He played guitar on Friday nights at a small bar in Los Feliz, not as a professional engagement, but as an informal residency that the bar's owner had offered after hearing Danny play one evening when the scheduled act cancelled. It paid less than his engineering work and required less from him technically, which was perhaps why he loved it in a way the engineering work, for all its satisfaction, didn't quite reach. The audience on Friday nights was small, inconsistent, and paying more attention to their drinks than to the music, which turned out to be the ideal condition for playing with complete honesty. There was no career calculation in it. Nobody from a record label was in the room. Wanted and went home. This was the music wanted and went home. This was the music he'd come to Los Angeles to make, and the irony of that was not lost on him, that the version of his musical life that felt truest had required the complete destruction of the version he'd originally sought. The regulatory story around Quaaludes reached its conclusion during these years, in the slow, bureaucratic way that regulatory stories always conclude, through accumulating pressure, documentation, and the eventual political will to act on what had been known for a decade. The DEA had been building toward full scheduling since the early 1970s. By 1984, methaqualone was placed on Schedule 1, the most restrictive classification, joining heroin and LSD as substances with no recognised medical use and high abuse potential. The pharmaceutical company that had marketed Quaaludes as non-addictive had long since exited the business quietly, without apology, without acknowledgement of what the lie had cost. The prescribing doctors who had run the clinic network, the ones who hadn't lost their licenses in the mid-1970s crackdowns, had diversified into other pharmaceuticals, applying the same clinical flexibility to new molecules. The industry executives who had used the drug as a tool of exploitation faced no legal consequence specific to that use, because the legal framework for prosecuting what happened in those back rooms was either non-existent or unenforced, and the women who had been harmed had nowhere to take their testimony that would produce any result other than further harm to themselves. Saul Mercer continued throwing parties until 1979, when a civil matter involving financial impropriety, nothing to do with drugs or exploitation, something purely about money and contracts, resulted in a settlement that reduced his operational capacity significantly. He moved to a smaller house. The parties stopped. The industry absorbed his absence without visible disruption, which said everything about the relationship between the industry and the individuals who operated within it. Danny learned about Mercer's reduced circumstances through the studio network, in the casual way that entertainment industry gossip travels, quickly, without particular weight, as though the diminishment of a powerful man was simply another item in the endless inventory of who was up and who was down. He felt no satisfaction about it. The justice was too small and too late and too unrelated to the actual harm to function as resolution. Real accountability would have required mechanisms that didn't exist, and a cultural willingness to apply them that was at least 2 decades away. What did exist by the late 1970s was a growing body of documentation about what methaqualone had done to American society during its decade of availability, the overdose statistics, the addiction treatment admissions, the neurological damage cases like Ray's, the pharmaceutical diversion networks that had supplied the street market. Researchers were publishing, journalists were writing. The picture being assembled piece by piece was precise and damning. Nobody who had made the decisions that enabled the crisis read the research and revise their self-assessment. This is perhaps the most consistent feature of institutional harm, not the initial decision, which can usually be explained if not excused by the pressures and incentives of its context, but the absolute imperviousness to retrospective accountability. The pharmaceutical company that marketed a lie didn't revisit the lie. The prescribing doctors who had enabled mass addiction didn't hold professional reckonings. The industry that had used the drug as a predatory tool didn't examine its own practices. The decade ended and the next one began, and everyone kept moving, because movement is the only direction available to people who have decided not to look back. Danny started writing things down in 1979. Not for publication, that was not the impulse, or at least not initially. The impulse was more basic, the need to get the material outside his body, to arrange the years into some kind of sequence that made sense on paper, even if it hadn't made sense while he was living through it. He wrote in composition notebooks, longhand, sitting at his kitchen table in the mornings before work. He wrote about the Laurel Canyon party, about the studio sessions and the pills and the specific texture of the crawl, about Sandra on the bathroom floor and the 90 seconds he spent moving things before calling for help, about the girl at Mercer's party whose face he still had with complete clarity. He wrote about what it had felt like to be 24 and in Los Angeles and handed something that dissolved every fear he'd ever had, and about the precise moment in the East Side Recovery Center when he'd understood that the dissolution of fear was not the same thing as the resolution of it, and that a life built on the former was not a life at all, but a very convincing deferral. The notebooks accumulated. He didn't show them to anyone. By 1980, the cultural conversation had moved on from Quaaludes with the speed of a city that processes everything through the metabolism of novelty. Cocaine was the story now. Wall Street, Hollywood, the White House periphery, the pervasive white powder of an era that mistook stimulation for intelligence and energy for health. The pharmaceutical obituary for methaqualone was written in regulatory filings and medical journals, not in cultural memory. The drug had been the thing, and then it wasn't, and the people it had destroyed were incorporated into the decade's general ledger of excess and filed away. Danny Caruso was not filed away. He was in Burbank, engineering sessions for artists whose names occasionally appeared on records he would see in store windows, living in Silver Lake in the same apartment where the collapse had centered and the reconstruction had begun, playing guitar on Friday nights to an audience that didn't know his history and wouldn't have found it interesting if they did. He called his mother on Sundays. He attended the support group on Wednesdays, less frequently than in the early years, but consistently enough to maintain the connection to the community, to the reality check, to the simple reminder that the thing he was managing daily was real and required management. He saw Victor twice a year for individual sessions, not out of clinical necessity, but out of the recognition that certain relationships are worth maintaining beyond their immediate utility. He was not famous. He had not achieved anything that the version of himself stepping off a Greyhound in 1971 would have recognized as success. The trajectory he'd imagined, the record deal, the albums, the career, had been dismantled so completely that even its ruins were mostly gone now, absorbed back into the general landscape of things that hadn't happened. What remained was a life, specific, textured, his own, not the life of someone who'd been given everything and squandered it, which was the narrative the industry preferred for people like Danny, because that narrative located the failure in the individual and left the structure intact. The actual story was more complicated and less flattering to the city that had supplied both the dream and the mechanism of its destruction. The notebooks grew. The Friday nights continued. The guitar on the stand beside the bed was played and maintained and played again. One evening in the spring of 1980, Danny sat at his kitchen table with a composition notebook open in front of him and wrote a sentence that was not about himself. It was about Cheryl, about the girl in Arizona who'd gone through a doorway while he turned back to his conversation. He wrote it plainly, without self-exculpation, without the rhetorical moves that people use to soften their own worst moments into something more survivable. Just the facts, in sequence, with the weight of them intact. Then he wrote about Ray's hand, about Sandra teaching children in Portland, about the version of the 1970s that existed in the bodies of the people who'd actually lived through it, rather than in the retrospective glow of cultural nostalgia. He didn't publish any of it. The notebooks went into a box under the bed, where they remained for years, not hidden, exactly, but private. Testimony without audience, which is perhaps its own form of integrity. Outside the window, Los Angeles continued its perennial performance. New people were arriving. The parties had different names and different drugs and the same architecture. The industry kept running its particular engine, extracting from the pliable and the hopeful, discarding them when they were no longer useful, incorporating their damage into the general backdrop of a city too, in love with its own mythology to examine what the mythology was built on. Danny Caruso was alive. That was not a small thing, and he had stopped treating it as one. He was 33 years old, and he had survived something that the city that created it had never officially acknowledged creating. He had no interest in being a cautionary tale or a recovery story, or any other narrative category that reduced what he'd lived through to a lesson for other people's consumption. He was just a man in Silver Lake who played guitar on Friday nights, and showed up to work on time and called his mother on Sundays and understood, with a clarity that no pill had ever produced, and no amount of damage had been able to permanently extinguish, exactly how much it cost to be still standing. The 1970s were over. The damage they'd done was not, and in a box under a bed in Silver Lake, in 9 composition notebooks filled with careful handwriting, the real version of the decade sat in the dark, unread, unpublished, irreducible, true.